Right now, the world is watching the wrong thing. You are being told that the Middle East is on the brink of a massive, explosive escalation. But while everyone is looking at the sky, waiting for missiles, they are missing what just happened on the water. Four small Iranian ships just sailed straight through a United States naval blockade. They didn't sneak through in the dead of night. They didn't use invisible cloaking technology. They sailed right through the grid, and the most powerful, most technologically advanced maritime force in human history did absolutely nothing to stop them. If you turn on the news today, the mainstream analysts will tell you this was a diplomatic choice. They will say Washington allowed these vessels to pass to avoid a broader regional war. They will call it de-escalation. I am Professor Jiang, and I am telling you right now, that is a comforting lie. What you just witnessed was not a diplomatic concession. It was a catastrophic structural failure of American maritime deterrence. The question you should be asking is not, why did the US let them through? The real question, the terrifying question, is why was the United States Navy structurally incapable of stopping them? We are witnessing the silent collapse of the global shipping order, a collapse that is going to hit your wallet, your gas tank, and your grocery bill much faster than you realize. The media thinks this is about four ships. It is not. It is about one hidden mechanism that has completely paralyzed the American military machine, a mechanism I call the asymmetric cost trap. And to understand how four inferior, low-tech ships just broke the back of a superpower's blockade, you have to look at what happens when the hidden, underlying math of modern war permanently inverts. Let me be very clear about what you are seeing on your television screens right now. It is a highly coordinated exercise in narrative control. If you listen to the mainstream geopolitical analysts, they will sell you a story of measured restraint. They claim the Pentagon is playing a brilliant game of four-dimensional chess, intentionally holding back fire to keep diplomatic backchannels open with Tehran. They want you to believe that the United States actively chose not to intercept these four Iranian vessels to prevent a single spark from igniting the entire Persian Gulf. But that is the illusion of choice. When you are the global hegemon, maritime deterrence does not operate through restraint. It operates through the absolute, unquestionable certainty of consequences. If a naval blockade is permeable by choice, it ceases to be a blockade. It becomes a mere suggestion. Empires do not survive on suggestions. The analysts in the studios are looking at this through the lens of pure politics. But this is not a political problem. This is a structural and mathematical crisis. They want you to believe that Washington held the upper hand and simply showed mercy. But step back for a moment and look at the actual chessboard. If the United States Navy intercepts those four Iranian ships, what actually happens next? A firefight? Yes. But the deeper problem is how that firefight would be fought and the devastating cost of winning it. The media assumes an American destroyer simply presses a button, neutralizing the threat, and the problem goes away. They are completely ignoring the underlying economic and tactical math of modern naval engagements. The truth is, the US Navy did not hold fire out of diplomatic grace. They held fire because pulling the trigger would have exposed a fatal, humiliating weakness in their own armor to the entire world. They were paralyzed, and this is where things get genuinely dangerous. Because the rules of naval supremacy have not just changed, they have completely inverted. Let me explain exactly how a multi-billion-dollar US warship becomes a floating hostage to the asymmetric cost trap. Welcome to the asymmetric cost trap. This is the hidden mechanism that just broke the United States Navy, and it is the single most important concept in modern warfare. For the last 80 years, global maritime dominance was decided by who had the biggest, most expensive, and most technologically advanced ships. If you had a $2 billion Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, you controlled the sea. That era is officially dead. Here is the terrifying math of the asymmetric cost trap. When an American destroyer detects an incoming threat, whether it is an Iranian fast attack craft, a kamikaze drone, or a retrofitted commercial vessel, the United States Navy must immediately defend itself. To guarantee an absolute intercept, they fire a Standard Missile 2 or a Standard Missile 6. Do you know exactly what one of those interceptor missiles costs? Between $2 and $4 million. Do you know what the incoming Iranian drone or the retrofitted swarm boat costs? $20,000, maybe $50,000 at most. The media looks at this and confidently says, America can easily afford it. But that is the wrong metric. It is not just about the money. It is strictly about inventory. A United States destroyer carries a strictly limited number of vertical launch cells. Let us say 96 total. You cannot reload those tubes at sea. Once a warship fires its payload, it becomes a multi-billion-dollar sitting duck. It must leave the active combat zone and return to port to rearm. And this is exactly what Tehran knows. This is the ultimate trap. If the United States Navy opened fire on those 4 Iranian ships, they would not just be spending $10 million to sink $100,000 worth of steel. They would be dangerously depleting their extremely limited, unreloadable missile reserves on simple decoys. Iran desperately wants the United States to empty its magazines early because once the interceptors are gone, the real weapon, the hypersonic anti-ship ballistic missiles, are fired directly at an undefended aircraft carrier. The American commanders looked at their radar screens, looked at the brutal math, and realized they were entirely paralyzed. Firing their weapons was infinitely more dangerous than holding their fire. They were structurally forced to let the adversary pass right through the blockade. That alone tells you something chilling, but the strategic dread goes much deeper, because you still need to know exactly how those 4 ships bypass the grid. Let us go directly out onto the water. I want you to visualize exactly how this structural failure happened in real time. The United States Navy does not just park a single ship and call it a blockade. They build a highly complex 3-dimensional kill web. They use overhead military satellites, high-altitude MQ-9 Reaper drones, and advanced Aegis radar systems that can track a golf ball from hundreds of miles away. Nothing moves without Washington knowing. So, how do 4 inferior Iranian vessels simply slip right through a multi-billion-dollar net? They do not hide. They weaponize the rules of engagement against the very system designed to stop them. At precisely 0200 hours, the Iranian vessels entered the outer perimeter of the American blockade. But they did not approach in a standard, predictable military formation. They scattered strategically. They mixed themselves directly into the dense, chaotic lanes of international commercial shipping. They deliberately disguised their radar signatures by tightly shadowing massive civilian oil tankers, creating an absolute nightmare for American targeting algorithms. The American commanders aboard the destroyers immediately painted the targets. But here is the structural wall they hit. If the United States fires a multi-million-dollar interceptor into a crowded commercial sea lane, the risk of catastrophic collateral damage is immense. Sinking a civilian oil tanker by accident would trigger a global diplomatic meltdown and an instant, catastrophic ecological disaster. Tehran knew this perfectly well. The 4 Iranian ships deliberately used the fragile global economy as a massive, floating human shield. But the true tactical genius of this breakthrough was the payload ambiguity. The American sensor grid could see the ships clearly, but they could not verify what was hidden under the canvas tarps on the decks. Were these vessels carrying advanced, forward-deployed anti-ship cruise missiles? Or were they entirely empty decoys? If they were empty, and the US Navy fired, America falls directly into the asymmetric cost trap, wasting irreplaceable interceptors on floating scrap metal. The American commander was trapped in an impossible paradox. To shoot is to lose. To hold fire is to surrender the blockade completely. So the Aegis destroyers tracked them. The overhead drones watched them. And the 4 Iranian ships, moving at a steady 20 knots, sailed straight past the red line. The impenetrable American maritime grid was exposed as entirely paralyzed by a low-tech, high-leverage maneuver. The blockade was broken without a single shot being fired. But if you truly think this humiliating tactical defeat stays isolated in the waters of the Middle East, you are gravely mistaken, because the global shipping markets were watching this exact sequence of events unfold. And the devastating economic contagion is about to hit your bank account directly. Let us step completely away from the radar screens and look directly at your bank account. Because the moment those 4 Iranian ships crossed the American blockade, an invisible shockwave hit the global financial system. You might think a naval standoff thousands of miles away has absolutely nothing to do with you. You are wrong. This is where the geopolitics translates into raw, punishing economic reality. The global economy runs on one fundamental assumption, that the United States Navy guarantees the absolute safety of international sea lanes. That guarantee is the only reason a massive container ship can transport your electronics, your medicine, and your energy across the world cheaply. But those 4 ships just shattered that illusion. And the first people to panic were not the politicians in Washington. They were the maritime insurance brokers in London. When an American blockade is proven porous, the risk of a commercial vessel being sunk skyrockets. Insurance premiums for any ship moving through these vital choke points do not just go up by a fraction. They multiply overnight. Shipping conglomerates look at this mathematical risk and make a brutal choice. They reroute their massive fleets entirely, adding thousands of miles and weeks of travel time around the Cape of Good Hope. Who exactly pays for that extra fuel? And who pays for that extra time? You do. This is the hidden tax of a collapsing empire. When shipping costs explode, the price of crude oil spikes. When oil spikes, the cost to transport every single item in your local grocery store surges. That box of cereal, that gallon of gas, the parts to fix your car, they all become significantly more expensive. Central banks will tell you this is just temporary inflation. It is not. It is the direct financial consequence of a paralyzed maritime superpower. The adversary understands this perfectly. They do not need to bomb New York to hurt Americans. They simply need to make the oceans too expensive to navigate. By breaking the blockade, they have placed a structural chokehold on the Western supply chain. They are bleeding the American consumer dry without ever firing even a single bullet. And this is the critical part almost nobody is talking about, because this exact sequence of events has happened before. To understand the terrifying truth of how this ends, you must look closely at the undeniable phantom of fallen empires past. If you step back for a moment and look at the vast sweep of history, this precise pattern is terrifyingly familiar. What you are watching right now is not unprecedented. It is the exact sequence that collapsed the deterrence of the British Empire. At the absolute height of their power, the British Royal Navy was the undisputed master of the high seas. They built massive, expensive dreadnoughts to project absolute global dominance. They operated under the assumption that sheer tonnage and advanced firepower made them invincible. But when the nature of warfare shifted in the early 20th century, when cheap, asymmetric weapons like submarines and naval mines flooded the oceans, the massive British battleships suddenly became terrifying liabilities. They were too valuable to lose, and so they spent entire wars hiding in heavily fortified ports. The moment a superpower is afraid to use its most expensive weapons because losing them is financially catastrophic, their actual power evaporates. The deterrence is broken. And that is the exact structural parallel we are witnessing today with the United States Navy. This is the phantom of empires past. Rome built an unparalleled military machine, but fell because their borders became too vast, too expensive, and too complex to defend against highly motivated, decentralized, low-tech tribes. America has built an incredible fleet of billion-dollar destroyers, but they are now paralyzed by $20,000 drones and modified commercial ships. The historical rule is brutal, but absolute. When an empire's military technology becomes too exquisite and expensive to risk in asymmetric combat, the actual cost of defending the global order exceeds the empire's ability to pay. And that alone tells you something deeply unsettling about what happens next. Because the rest of the world has just been handed the exact blueprint on how to defeat an American blockade. If this trend continues, the world will fundamentally fracture in the next few years. Because the single most dangerous part of this failure is not what just happened in the Middle East. It is what happens when Beijing and Moscow analyze the exact structural collapse of the American blockade. This is where the logic changes. Because those 4 Iranian ships were not just moving equipment. They were testing a critical global hypothesis. And they proved it correct. The United States Navy is fundamentally paralyzed by the asymmetric cost trap. Now, the rest of the world has a playbook. Here is what happens next. This is the cascade effect. Prediction number 1. China will immediately weaponize this exact maritime paralysis in the South China Sea. If Washington is too terrified to fire a multi-million-dollar interceptor at a cheap, retrofitted Iranian vessel, how will they ever justify the staggering financial risk of defending an island nation thousands of miles away against thousands of cheap, autonomous, asymmetric Chinese naval drones? The American deterrence in the Pacific just lost all credibility overnight. Beijing now knows they do not need to sink an American carrier. They simply need to bankrupt its vertical launch cells with cheap decoys. Prediction number 2. The cost of maritime insurance will permanently restructure global trade. Watch this variable closely. The era of cheap, globalized shipping is over. As commercial vessels realize the United States Navy cannot actually protect them from low-tech swarms, the insurance markets will refuse to underwrite massive container ships moving through contested choke points. We are going to see a massive, desperate pivot back to regionalized, highly expensive land-based supply chains. Prediction number 3. The rapid proliferation of asymmetric naval warfare will accelerate beyond state control. If a nation under severe economic sanctions can effectively break a superpower's blockade with $20,000 technology and commercial human shields, every rogue actor, every non-state militia, and every regional power will instantly replicate this model. The oceans are about to become incredibly dangerous and chaotic zones of conflict. The structure beneath the headlines is the real story. The world order is not simply shifting, it is actively crumbling under the crushing weight of its own defensive costs. And the American taxpayer is about to foot the massive, impossible bill. But the deeper problem is still ahead, because the consequences are about to hit you personally. Let me be absolutely clear about what this means for you and your family. The silent collapse of American maritime deterrence is not just a theoretical war game played in the Pentagon. It is a direct, inescapable tax on your daily existence. When the oceans suddenly become contested zones, the long era of cheap goods, stable inflation, and reliable global energy dies. Every single time you buy groceries, pay for heating, or fill your car, you are paying the brutal price of the asymmetric cost trap. Real people always pay the ultimate price for failing empires. While the politicians and mainstream media spin comforting tales of diplomatic de-escalation, working-class citizens are the exact ones who will bear the crushing weight of skyrocketing supply chain costs and inevitable economic stagnation. The world you grew up in, a world heavily underwritten by the unquestioned safety of the seas, is quietly being dismantled by $20,000 drones and 4 small ships that just called the ultimate bluff. The global order is not about to change. It has already changed permanently. The United States Navy did not choose to simply let those vessels pass. They were mathematically forced to watch their own structural irrelevance play out in real time, and the rest of the world was closely taking notes. The invisible blockade is officially broken, and it is never coming back. If you want to survive the massive economic and geopolitical shockwaves that are coming next, you have to stop watching the manufactured headlines and start watching the deeper structural mechanics. I am Professor Jiang. If you recognize the terrifying patterns I see, you must act now. Leave a comment below, subscribe to the channel, and share this video before the reality hits your doorstep. The truth is hard, but in this new era, ignorance is absolutely fatal.